One thing about the Sijo that's worth noting, and let me go into the history of it for just a moment. It may seem unremarkable for me to state the Sijo is in Korean, but in Korea, over the centuries, way back into the Three Kingdoms period, serious formal writing was all in Chinese, written down in classical Chinese. And the histories were written in Chinese, formal court government records were kept in Chinese, genealogies, the family histories were in Chinese, and the verse that you composed on occasions like birthdays or annual celebrations of various kinds, that was all done in Chinese. And what's remarkable about the Sijo form is that it's in the Korean language. And it's kind of an indigenous expression of cultural identity vis-a-vis the Chinese presence. That's one of the things that's quite striking about it. And in one of the Sijo that we'll look at in some detail, these two realms of language, the Chinese language and the Korean language, are kind of played off against each other in a very interesting and deliberate way. But the Sijo became, in the 16th century, a form of vernacular native expression among the very highly accomplished leaders of the government, the upper class, the aristocracy, the yangban, as they're described or stated in the Korean language, and people they associated with. Over the course of the centuries, other people began to pick up the form. And in Richard Rutt's book, there are quite a number of anonymous Sijo from the 18th and 19th centuries. And anonymous means that they were composed by people who didn't have sort of a place in upper class Korean society. And some of those are really quite playful, quite funny, and stretch the form in very interesting ways. Then you get to the end of the 19th century, and the Japanese colonial takeover of Korea in 1910. And with the colonial takeover, a lot of questions about what's modern. How can we be modern in Korea? And in literature, one direction that people pursued was to look at Western writing. And poets like Baudelaire and Yeats and others were very popular in Korea in the late teens and on into the 1920s. And people began to write not imitations, but kind of responses to what they saw from, for example, Baudelaire's poems about Paris in the mid-19th century. That had a real resonance for writers in Seoul in the 1920s, because they too were wandering around in a modernizing city and feeling kind of unconnected from their neighbors, from other people in the streets, and a lot of the writing went that way. But there were also poets in Korea in the 1920s who were trying to look into the Korean traditional practices and find ways, for example, to turn the Sijo into a modern form. And they experimented with linking Sijo together in a long sequence, different subject matter, references in the Sijo to things that were very modern at that moment. And the Sijo continued all the way through the 20th century as a kind of, I think, form connected to the past that people were trying to find a way to bring into the present. And then nowadays, in the 21st century, you've got the Korea wave, and you've got B, right? Rain, this very popular singer, performer, actor. You've got the television drama, Winter Sonata, and various other things that are very popular all around the world. And the Sijo, I think, could jump in there if it can find a way, for example, to connect with some of the new dance that's being done or some of the new music, and I'll explore that a little bit. But I think people nowadays feel kind of, those who are writing the Sijo, feel a little bit challenged. How can we make the Sijo happen again in the 21st century in a way that connects to the world outside, as Korea has through the Korea wave? And one very indirect measure of the degree of interest that's out there in exploring how to do that, how to get the Korean Sijo out there and popular.